This is PTV World. I am Syed Shabahat and you are watching Fault Lines. The diplomatic and political temperature between China and United States is not coming down. As we covered a couple of weeks ago, from downing of Chinese balloon by United States, the temperature started rising up and it's rising to this date. Recently, some very hard statements have come from China in response to what United States has been doing. And one of the best statements that I would like to specifically quote has come from Qin Zhang, who has remained Chinese ambassador to United States. In a recent news appearance, media appearance, he has said that Washington is trying to encircle China through its Indo-Pacific strategy. Also, the temperature is rising for many other reasons, including a very important development that has taken place. That is, Taiwanese president has invited U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy to visit Taiwan. China certainly is not happy with this development. Team Fault Lines have prepared a package. Watch the package before I bring my first guest to the program.
Geopolitical tensions have spiraling over the past several months between great powers, culminating in the United States shot down a Chinese spy balloon over its territory in early February. The recent remarks by Chinese President Xi Jinping and the new Chinese Foreign Minister certainly point to rising temperatures in Sino-US relations. President Xi commented that the United States is leading the containment, encirclement, and suppression of China, adding that his country must have the courage to fight. In separate comments, Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang spoke of conflict and confrontation between his country and the United States, warning of catastrophic consequences if Washington continued on its current path. Amid brewing Sino-US tensions, there is unprecedented development in China as Xi Jinping was unanimously elected President of People's Republic of China and Chairman of the Central Military Commission of the PRC at the ongoing session of the 14th National People's Congress. The announcement was followed by fervent declarations by delegates to the Chinese Constitution in demonstration of loyalty and unanimity. Xi's re-election is the zenith of remarkable rise in which he has become a leader of a rising global power. The beginning of his unprecedented third term comes as the world's second largest economy is navigating strained ties with US and Ukraine crisis in exacerbating geopolitical fault lines.
To talk about this, my first guest in program is Peterson, who is an analyst, works for Militant Wire Network and is based in Washington, D.C. He's joining me on Skype. Peterson, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me today, Syed.
We are discussing this bilateral relationship between China and the United States. And before I ask my first question, there is a statement that I would want to play, a statement by Wang Wenbin, who is a spokesman of Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This is very interesting. Listen to the statement before I take your comments on it.
我也很想知道什么叫做摧毁台湾的计划。美方应该做出明明白白的解释。台湾是中国的台湾，我们将坚定不移捍卫国家主权和领土完整。
Yes, Peterson.
I think this is effectively some standard rhetoric from the Chinese government. Since the Shanghai Communique of 1972, the United States has acknowledged that there is one China and that Taiwan is part of China. The trouble for the U.S. is that in 1979, it switched its recognition of the official government of China from the Republic of China, the government now in control of Taiwan, to the People's Republic of China, the government now in control of the rest of China. The government of the People's Republic of China sees Taiwan as a province in rebellion, and any U.S. support for that province is interference in the internal affairs of China. Ultimately, the Chinese government wants the U.S. to cease its military support of Taiwan, which is unlikely to happen as the U.S. is bound by law through the Taiwan Relations Act to provide military aid to Taiwan.
But why do you believe there is so much concern in China with regards to Taiwan if United States policy and the practice that it has been doing are so clear? Do you believe there is some fears inside China that United States might revise its policy with regards to Taiwan?
I think this kind of goes back to what you mentioned earlier at the start of the program. In terms of China being a rising power and the U.S. being the sort of incumbent power, I think that as China's power is increasing, the U.S. is growing concerned that its hegemony in the Western Pacific is less likely to remain in effect. In terms of actually changing U.S. policy, I think this will be very difficult to do. This goes back to what I've just mentioned in terms of the Taiwan Relations Act, which sort of prohibits U.S. presidents from unilaterally changing U.S. policy toward Taiwan. It requires the consent of the U.S. Congress.
Peterson, the way things are going forward now, Mr. Xi has secured third term, and there is going to be certainly a consistency of policies in China, because Xi's emergence as such a strong leader, one of the most powerful leaders in Chinese history, certainly endorses the backing of the political system of China to Xi's policies at large. And Xi's policies toward the United States have been crystal clear. I mean, good or bad, whatever you call it, but there is going to be a continuity of the same. So how concerned should the United States be with Xi's emergence as such a strong leader?
Well, I think that Xi's emergence as a strong leader is something that the U.S. government might consider to be alarming. I think that this is the case, through securing a third term as president, and I think more importantly, through securing a third term as chairman of the Communist Party and the Central Military Commission. President Xi has shown that he is the most powerful leader in China since Mao Zedong. I think it's likely that in part because of his power domestically, he will be willing to continue taking a hard line on Chinese territorial claims in the East and South China Seas, as well as in other places. In terms of what this means for U.S.-China relations, I think that the so-called liberal international order will continue to be challenged by the Chinese assertively advancing their territorial claims, as well as other foreign policy initiatives that might be opposed to what people often think of as the liberal international order. Additionally, I think that we can sort of see a continuation of so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, where Chinese diplomats are making their case against U.S. foreign policy initiatives and moves in a rather blunt manner.
Mr. Peterson, I would want to draw your attention to another important development that is taking place in this region, and that is in Philippines, where United States is trying to add some further strength to its military presence in the basis that it's operating. Don't you think this should be another area of concern for China, and how do you believe China is going to respond back to it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, once again, you can sort of look at the Western Pacific as the key area of conflict here. In terms of how things are going, right now the United States has effectively military hegemony in the Western Pacific, and this is being challenged by the rise of China. The U.S. has maintained this hegemony since the end of the Second World War, after the defeat of Japan at the end of that war. Currently, the United States maintains military bases in both Japan and the Philippines. The Filipino-U.S. relationship is a little more complex. In 1991, the Philippines government decided that it didn't want any more permanent foreign military bases in its country. So under Filipino law, foreign military bases are not allowed on a permanent basis. However, there are a number of ways that the governments of the Philippines and the U.S. can get around this prohibition, including by having American troops stationed in the Philippines on a rotational basis, as has been done for the U.S. on the eastern front of the U.S.-led NATO alliance, in the case of the multinational battle groups that are rotating through there. In response to the establishment of these new American bases in the Philippines, the Chinese government has accused the U.S. of exacerbating tensions in the region and endangering regional peace and stability. So I think that regardless of the U.S.'s actions and China's perception, I think that things are going to continue to heat up.
So you believe China is going to respond to it through something more than words, because this is hardcore establishment of security built up, which certainly will have consequences for China as well?
I certainly think that in the case of the Philippines and the United States have a long-lasting relationship. This goes back to the fact that the Philippines was once an American colony. And while that colonial status ended in 1946, there was a strong relationship between the United States and the Philippines ever since, nonetheless. Um, I think that the reintroduction of American military bases into the Philippines is certainly something that will be seen by China as alarming. But I think because of the pre-existing relationship, I think that it's unlikely that this is going to be a substantial increase in the sort of perception of tensions in the area. What is interesting, though, is that the Filipino government has decided that it's alarmed enough about the situation to reintroduce American military bases.
Now, there is another important development in the same region that I would want you to comment on, and this is the improvement of relationship between Russia and China, or the cooperation that is emerging. United States apparently is quite concerned. And do you believe this cooperation between the two sides can very soon translate into a military cooperation? Because certainly, as the entire West is supporting in name of NATO alliance to the Ukrainians, Russian side must also be looking for someone to militarily strengthen them further in this very important conflict.
Yeah, I think that the Russian-Chinese relationship is strengthening, at least in part, as a result of the U.S. not giving the two nations any real choice in the matter. The Russian invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions ultimately imposed on Russia as a result of the invasion ultimately limited the number of countries that are willing to work with Russia. China, sort of by virtue of its economic size and its position as a separate pole in an increasingly multipolar world, is partly insulated from any potential risks of cooperating with Russia, unlike smaller countries which run the risk of running afoul of Western sanctions against Russia. Furthermore, while Russia and China both likely need each other as the world is increasingly multipolar, the world is still substantially under the sway of American institutions. This means that at this point in time, China has to seriously consider any potential risks of working with the Russians. And we can see that in the relationship between Russia and China. Russia is clearly the junior partner, so to speak. In effect, that means that the Russians will benefit from the relationship with China when the Chinese view it as in their interest to help the Russians in some way or another. So while the Chinese will do their best to ensure that Russia doesn't fail, it's also highly likely that the Chinese will support Russia only to the extent that it's providing China with needed resources and otherwise keeping the U.S.'s attention focused on Eastern Europe as opposed to the Western Pacific.
And from the Russian perspective, how do you think Russia would be expecting China to facilitate? I mean, we just discussed the military part of it, but fact of the matter is that Russia has a lot of other resources that it was initially selling to Europe and United States, which it's unable to do any further given the economic sanctions that it has. So how do you expect Russia to cooperate with, or what should be Russia's expectations with China going forward?
I think Russia's expectations and its hopes might be two slightly different things. I think going forward, it certainly expects a lot of Chinese support in terms of rhetoric, in terms of verbal support. In terms of material support, though, I think this might be a little more difficult, and it will be dependent on a lot of factors. At this point in time, China's best option is to sort of wait and see what happens in Ukraine. An extended war in Ukraine is certainly bad for the Russians, let alone the Ukrainians, but it's also likely bad for the U.S. This may seem counterintuitive for some people, as American strategy in Europe appears to be to keep supplying the Ukrainian forces with weapons and training to keep the Russian military tied down for an extended period, thereby restricting Russia's ability to act elsewhere in the world. However, extended U.S. support for Ukraine means that stocks of American arms and ammunition are continually being drawn down, and currently the U.S. does not have the industrial capacity to quickly replace many of those weapons. This means that in the event of war against China over Taiwan, the U.S. may not be able to effectively supply Taiwan with weapons, let alone supply its own troops with weapons. Furthermore, if the U.S. is focused on combating Russia and Ukraine, then less attention is devoted to the Western Pacific, where the U.S.'s critical strategic interests really lay. A U.S. focused on Ukraine is a U.S. that is largely unable to turn its attention toward China, which China would prefer. So, in an effort to prolong the war in Ukraine, and keep American attention focused there, China may consider sending arms to Russia if it continues to see advantage in keeping the U.S. tied down in Europe. However, China is likely currently balancing the risks of sanctions against the rewards of a distracted and disarmed U.S. I think it's more likely at this point that China would supply Russia with more arms and ammunition if Russia begins to clearly lose the war in Ukraine. But that China is less likely to provide support if the Russians keep the pressure on Ukraine. So ultimately, in terms of Russia's expectations, I think that Russia should expect to not receive substantial support from China unless things start to turn quite bad in Ukraine.
And lastly, Mr. Carl Peterson, how do you see the meeting between the president of Belarus and President Xi Jinping recently, wherein apparently Belarus is also inviting China for some further cooperation, maybe in economic terms. We don't know exact specifics of this meeting, but how do you believe a country as significant as Belarus, we understand Belarus has played a very important part in this war that Russia initiated against Ukraine. What would be the expectation from the Belarusian side?
Well, certainly going into this meeting, a lot of the meeting with Belarus and China seemed to focus around concern over so-called color revolutions. Color revolutions are a key concern for the U.S.'s strategic opponents. Color revolutions, of course, refers to what countries like Russia claim are Western-led coups where mass social unrest causes governments sympathetic to Russia or Russian allies to fall, and then be replaced by governments more sympathetic to the West. While there are a number of countries that are alleged to have had color revolutions, in particular, we often think of color revolutions occurring within the Russian sphere of influence, with some notable examples being the 2003 Rose Revolution in Georgia, the 2004 Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and once again in Ukraine in 2014 with the Euromaidan uprisings that ultimately led to the downfall of the pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych. However, there have been some more recent examples of what critics call attempted color revolutions in both Belarus in 2020 and Kazakhstan in 2022. While both of these uprisings were stopped by the governments in power, the one in Kazakhstan was only done so with the help of Russian military forces. I think that enhanced cooperation between Belarus and China in the area of opposing color revolutions is another example of China doing its best to keep the U.S. tied down in Europe as a way of keeping the U.S.'s attention away from the Western Pacific. While China does have an interest in supporting its allies and countries that are more sympathetic toward it, ultimately I think that Belarus would benefit more from cooperation with China than China would benefit from cooperation with Belarus.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carl Peterson, for being guest in our program today.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, this was Mr. Carl Peterson from Washington, D.C., and he helped us to understand the overall larger situation taking place between China and the United States. We understand that these are not isolated events as reported by international media. Certainly, there are many other dimensions and aspects of the same problems that are strategically stitched with many neighboring countries, and the interest of both the nations spread around this region. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break and we'll join you back with second segment of program. Stay with us. Welcome back. Ladies and gentlemen, the war between Russia and Ukraine is the largest conflict of our contemporary times that we have seen. We understand that Europe has not seen a war larger than this ever since Second World War is over. Not only with regards to the casualty count, but also with respect to the number of weapons utilized and the massive influx of people going to Europe from Ukraine makes this war very important event in the history of contemporary Europe. Now, the winters are almost over. That were thought to be one of the largest advantages that Russia got bank upon. The winters are over. Europe has survived this entire winter without taking any serious disadvantage on the war front of Ukraine, and there is a state of stalemate between Russia and Ukraine. Rather, Russian military has recently started gaining more grounds as the Battle of Bakhmut is getting a lot of traction from international media. Team Fault Lines have prepared a package. Watch the package before I bring my first guest to this part of my program.
The conflict in Ukraine has dramatically changed the world and is shaping future of Europe and global security order in decisive manner. The intense fighting around eastern city of Bakhmut has been the longest and bloodiest in more than a year-long Ukraine conflict, which has devastated swaths of Ukraine and displaced millions of people. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg warned that the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut may fall into Russian hands in the coming days after months of intense fighting. Ukraine's military said it had managed to push back intense Russian attacks on the city of Bakhmut despite a Russian claim of control over its eastern half. According to Ukrainian officials, Russian missiles hit several cities across Ukraine, including the capital Kiev, the Black Sea port of Odessa, and the northeastern city of Kharkiv. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres visited Kiev for talks with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on extending grain shipments from the war-torn country and securing the safety of nuclear power plant. Meanwhile, European Union foreign ministers gathered in Stockholm with a push to provide more ammunition to Ukraine forces high on their agenda. With fighting raging on and no peace talks on the horizon, Ukraine conflict has become most challenging geopolitical flashpoint which threatens to escalate great power tensions.
To join me from Canada on Skype, my guest in this part of show is Mr. Lucus Weber, who is co-owner and editor of militantwire.com. Lucus Weber, welcome to the show. My first question is, what is happening between Russia and Ukraine? The winters are over. The largest advantage that Russia was banking on is over. Where all of this is now heading to, and what exactly would be running in mind of Russian leaders to go about this war?
Thank you very much for having me, Saeed. Instead of a large-scale or big arrow offensive, Russia has simply continued on with pursuing an artillery-centric war of attrition, and this is designed to leverage its firepower advantage over Ukraine. It is unclear if this is due to a lack of capacity or simply a decision not to do so. Most of the talk about some sort of massive winter push has actually come from the Western media, political officials, and the commentariat. There's little indication or evidence that Russian decision makers actually discussed publicly their intention to carry out such action. And to best understand Moscow's current mode of warfare, it's useful to look at the course adjustment made following the initial phases of the invasion. The initial large-scale incursion came from multiple directions. It was meant to disorientate and overwhelm the Ukrainians. This was purposed to force them into concessions of some kind. However, this attempt failed due to a series of flawed assumptions and an underestimation of the Ukrainians' will to fight and its ability to resist. Russia then studied its blunders and realized that it could not achieve its set objectives with the force numbers allocated. Russian forces were spread thin along various areas of the front line, and Ukraine, with U.S. and Western support, was able to use intelligence targeting information and military aid in order to create a force that was able to identify and exploit parts of the Russian lines that were severely undermanned and stretched thin. The result was that the Ukrainians were able to drive the Russians out of a large chunk of the Kharkov region and push them across the river in Kherson. These setbacks served as a kind of reality check for the Russians, and they subsequently mobilized 300,000 personnel with the purpose to replenish.
I'm sorry to cut you here, Lucas, but this brings us to a very important point as you are discussing the military developments that are being made by Russia. Now, Bakhmut has hit major headlines. This is not the first time Russia has invaded on a town or has attacked on a town, but the rhetoric around Bakhmut is way too much. So what exactly is happening and why Bakhmut is so important for Russia or Ukraine for that matter?
Bakhmut is strategically important as a geographical location in itself, as well as a major transportation and communications hub in the region. This is partially why it has been site to the most hotly contested battle of the entire war. And this is because, of course, both Ukraine and Russia fully understand its importance. If Russia were to win and take the city, which seems very likely at this time, it would be a major strategic, operational, and propaganda victory for the Russians. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky himself came out recently and explicitly stated that Ukrainian forces will not be given the order to withdraw, as the city's demise would open the gate to the next major defensive line at Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. It is also important to recognize that Ukraine's current defensive line, which has been severely compromised with the fall of Soledar, is the most defendable and heavily fortified in compared to lines being prepared behind it. For contingency, Ukraine is likely preparing new defenses at the Kramatorsk line. However, the region is not nearly as fortified when compared to Bakhmut. Bakhmut has been built up for the better part of the last decade during the post-Maidan revolution conflict. One of Russia's primary objectives in this war is to take the Donbass, and the fall of Bakhmut would represent a significant step towards doing so. Russian forces, spearheaded by the Wagner Group, have accelerated their advancement in the area, and Kiev's position as a result in Bakhmut is quickly deteriorating.
Lucas, sorry to cut you again, but since we are discussing this on a micro level, let's zoom out a bit and look at the larger picture. That perhaps will help us to develop a better understanding. We assumed that Russia was under an impression to conclude this war pretty quickly. And there is a reputation of a Russian army which, according to many in the West, was slightly overestimated. Russia has not been able to conclude the war in time. It has become one of the longest wars in its history. And how do you see this? Do you believe that Russian forces were overestimated, or had they overestimated themselves before they raided in Ukraine?
Russia was vastly overestimated at the beginning of the war, but now the pendulum seems to have swung the other way, and the Russian military is being somewhat underestimated. Despite its early blunders and miscalculations, Russia has again gained the initiative and is currently taking territory across various parts of the front line. And with all eyes on Bakhmut, these gains have been taking place from Zaporozhye in the south along DPR and LPR territories in the Avdiivka area and up to Seversk, Liman, and Kupiansk, the regions around these towns and settlements. Additionally, Moscow has currently controls about a fifth of Ukraine. It's on track to take more territory. It holds most of the coastline, has secured a land bridge to Crimea, and it is increasingly degrading Ukraine's energy grid. Ukraine's economy has been decimated while the country is being depopulated as a result of Russia's invasion and bombardment. This has caused millions to leave the country and has left many others internally displaced. If we contrast this to Russia, we see that Russia has a functioning military-industrial base, a much larger population than Ukraine, a bigger pool of military reserves and professionals to draw upon if they choose to do future mobilizations. And they also have the ability to consistently launch missile strikes from inside Russia and inside certain parts of Ukraine.
Point taken. Thank you very
almost
much, Lucas Weber, for being guest in our program today. Ladies and gentlemen, my last guest in this program is Miss Aisha Saeed. She's joining me on Skype from Lahore. Aisha, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Aisha, we are discussing this war between Russia and Ukraine, and I'm sure you must have heard what Lucas Weber was saying a while ago. Now, what do you believe is actually happening on ground? Is the Russian forces, as Lucas Weber was of the view, clearly at an advantage at this moment and are going to make best out of it? Or do you believe these are small advantages coming to them time in and time out, and both the forces are going to stay in a stalemate for a very long time?
I think the stalemate will extend, as you already mentioned. The war is, being extended year after year. So I think the Guardian actually gave a very valid headline saying that Bakhmut has become a killing zone for the Russians, which obviously the Ukrainians have a very fortified place in Bakhmut, and they have a vantage point in Bakhmut as well. So where you have advantage given to the Ukrainians in Bakhmut, there are disadvantages at their part as well, and the Russians as well. So I think I've mentioned this before in the program that there are small advantages, but with both the Ukrainians because they have the Western support. Russia, on the other hand, is on its own. But this battle is becoming more of a battle of strategic moves, of tactics between the militaries. So at the moment, the stalemate is that, one party advances to one place, the other advances to the other. We know the Ukrainians are in some border area of Russia. The Russians are doing the same. But this stalemate is because, both parties don't want to, end the war. So you will have these sort of, back and forth advancements between the two militaries, and one being on the advantage because they have the Western support.
Aisha, what is happening on the front of Bryansk? This is another region of Ukraine. We even struggle to pronounce these names. A Russian volunteering corps is making headlines. What exactly is happening on this front? Because there are various type of narratives coming from both the sides.
Well, I think Russians now use this narrative very often. When they feel defeated from one angle, they advance on the other side, like I said before. So what the Russians now are doing, that they've used drones, they've used missiles as well. But I think the civilian population caught in between the two is what's making the headlines, basically. So what the West will actually highlight if the Russian forces have captured a large number of people or killed civilians. These are the type of headlines you'd see coming out. But like I said, again, this is a back and forth movement. It's purely a military game between the two countries. And when they advance, I think the Russians at the moment are sort of calculating that if we lose at one point, we have to advance at the other point. So this is how the stalemate is, one, extending, but two, there's a danger of war being extended to all the domains, basically, not just civilian or not just military, but special groups which were recruited by the Russians in a very private capacity they're coming up as corps or special groups and all of these things. And the people from the reserve army, basically, and the Russians have joined as well. So you have more people within the Russian military that are not technically military but are special corps, or I think privately hired, that are trying to do these more dangerous operations in Ukraine.
And Aisha, how do you see the strategy of Ukrainians to cope up with all these paramount challenges that have been extended to them? On one side, they have an enemy as mighty as Russia, and on the other side, there is entire West supporting them all out, militarily, weapon-wise, economically providing support to their people. So how impressively or how effectively Ukraine is capitalizing on all these strengths and responding to the weaknesses that it is exposed to?
Well, I think the first part is very obvious. With supported by the Western powers in terms of their military, in terms of their finance, in terms of aid, they do have a certain advantage. But let me tell you, Russia and Ukraine on ground have no comparison, because one, the Russians have an advantage. If they want to extend the war, they can counter Ukraine and they can circle Ukraine from almost all angles. Because one, they don't want to escalate the situation or bring international laws in place or more sanctions against them. They're not doing that. Otherwise, it was much easier to, encircle Ukraine and basically invade the entire country. But since it involves the Western power, it involves international rules and regulations that the Russians, to an extent, are still following. This is why Ukraine is safe, to say the least, because the invasion is going on, the war is going on, but on the losing end, it's Ukraine basically, because no matter how many times the West tried to intervene, it has to stop the war at one point. So the civilian population is suffering, energy crises are there. Russia is not at loss on at least the surface.
Thank you very much, Aisha Saeed, for being guest in our program today. Ladies and gentlemen, the war between Russia and Ukraine is one of the most serious military conflicts of our contemporary time. A conflict that can anytime invite a nuclear attack. The world has to watch this very carefully, and all the nations that are not a part of this conflict so far need to play their part in facilitating a diplomatic end to this conflict. We'll join you next week with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.